origin of, shall we say, the successful and stable Greek party of the right that has continued up till today.
And this period of the 50s and 60s, I mean, it's not, at the political level. You've described something of it. Economically, it's actually rather a successful period, isn't it? I mean, you get really solid growth.
Yes, what you get is, I suppose, initially a very difficult situation, but there is the prospect of expanded international trade. I think what you have is, obviously, after the war, with the Marshall Aid, with the sort of rearmament in the early 50s, Korean War, a kind of expansion of public spending, a more Keynesian view of spending your way out of an economic depression. Governments are investing and spending more, markets are expanding, there is relatively full employment throughout Western Europe. So Greece is, shall we say, entering an international arena that is very, very much more hopeful and positive than it was in the period between the First and Second World Wars. It finds markets for its agricultural produce, it finds ready markets and expanding trade for its shipping services, and there's the possibility of Greeks who can't find jobs at home moving to countries in Western Europe, particularly West Germany, which is having a huge industrial boom, employing not only all of its own labour, but sucking in labour from many countries in the Mediterranean. And so you have a new source of remittances from overseas to...
This is also the Greece, I mean, rather stereotypically, that we all know from Zorba the Greek, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. So it's the period when, if you like, there has been terrible trauma, but there is a kind of hope for the future, renewed industrial activity. I think in Zorba the Greek was a Cretan lignite mine that comes back to life, and a whole sort of interesting story. But
at the same time, Zorba is this rustic macho, this drinker. Doesn't do very much. The stereotype has sort of has been hard to shake, hasn't it?
I think that's right. I think what people tend to see most often is sort of the slightly sort of bucolic aspect of Greece, which the inefficiencies and the corruption has its sort of bucolic charm, because that's part of the image that has attracted tourists to a land where nothing is taken too seriously, nothing is too urgent, nothing needs to happen immediately. The whole country has a degree of sort of personal charm and immense.
And in the film,
that is extraordinarily attractive. What people overlook, I suspect, is the astuteness of many Greek businessmen who are actually very used to dealing with a wide international market, very sharp in their dealings with their sort of trade competitors, and quite used to say making the system work for them. That's the other side, and of course it was that side, people like Onassis and Niarchos in international shipping, who were building up fortunes. Greek overseas trading community based in London, and also to some extent in America and Australia. All these people doing very well, but still keeping their connections with the old country.
And then in that period we start to get the arrival of there's a kind of hippie Greece as well in this, which gains prominence in that period, isn't there? So sort of descendants of Byron who've come to the islands.
That's absolutely right. I think there have always been, shall we say, people from Britain and France, particularly perhaps, who had this kind of romantic view of Greece, who had often sort of very long family connections with parts of Greece, who bought houses. And there are people, I suppose, before this, like Lawrence Durrell, who was used to living and hunting from Corfu in an age perhaps before Greeks all learned to speak English. They were prepared to understand the local culture, perhaps sort of far more than.
But still a sort of romanticism of the authentic rural, a glorification of a particular type of.
Yes, it was the glorification of shall we say, a romantic, rose-tinted view of a traditional way of life, which I suspect for those people who had to endure it was often sort of very harsh indeed, and quite patriarchal, probably stayed as it were, within the family, was very much handed down from father to son. And the daughters were expected to do an awful lot of hard manual work and treated relatively badly. It was certainly perhaps a society in which there was a kind of strict separation of gender roles, reinforced by tradition and to some extent by the church. And all of this gradually began to change, I think, during the 1950s. What you had was, of course, government of traditional kind by Papagos, who dies in 1955, replaced by Constantine Karamanlis, who's a very important figure, rules through New Democracy from 1955 to 1963. Karamanlis does really quite a lot to bring Greece into the modern world. He basically introduces restrictions on the dowry system. He does a lot of public work. He effectively encourages commercial and technical training and education, encourages girls to join the police and the army, breaks down quite a lot of the traditional stereotypes. Karamanlis has this sort of very effective period of rule, what appears.
So we have this rapid period of modernisation, but then bring us to 1968.
Well, I think you just have to look briefly at the mid-60s, because what happens is that basically King Paul, who rules in the period immediately after the war and is seen as a little bit of a slightly authoritarian, or his wife is seen as rather pro-German, Queen Frederica, sort of slightly unsympathetic character. He dies in, I think, 1964, is replaced by the young and dashing Constantine II. Now, initially, Constantine II gets on quite well with even the sort of centrist politician George Papandreou, but problems arise when Papandreou starts investigations into the political sympathies of army officers. There are problems both with the sort of the left and the right, suggestions of a left-wing conspiracy in which George's son Andreas has been involved. So George Papandreou tries to take over the defence ministry himself. King Constantine won't have that. Papandreou resigns. There's then a period where various people in the Central Party effectively defect, the so-called apostates. There's a very unstable government then for 18 months. And in the meantime, Papandreou is rallying sort of political support rather to the left, rather against the king. There's a supposition that in 1967 there will be a general election which Papandreou is likely to win. A lot of the army are very anxious by what they see as a kind of revival of leftism, particular political threats.
And this has echoes of the Civil War, does it, at this point?
Yes, that's right. I think there is certainly, shall we say, a revival in rather covert form of communist and far-left activity in trade unions. The sort of alliance of socialists and the sort of left centrists under Papandreou, suggestion as well that the left is coming back as a major force, and this will be bad for, shall we say, the people on the right, particularly right-wing army officers, but also the many other of those on the right who've enjoyed, as it were, a couple of good decades could find themselves subject to effectively a hostile socialist regime.
But what has happened to the Communist Party in this period? Because the Communist Party essentially, after losing the war, does it continue to organise? Is it still an important institution?
Well, essentially it's underground. Essentially it's illegal. It has a front body called the EDA, and there are always suggestions that those in the EDA are in fact more than communists. So officially it's illegal, but in practice it sort of operates as a kind of front organisation.
And the socialists? Is there a socialist party? Are we in
yes, there's a socialist party. I mean, this period is really the kind of roots of PASOK, the sort of pan-Hellenic socialist party. But at this stage, in fact, George Papandreou is, as it were, part of the fragmented Centre Party. His son Andreas, who in fact was somebody educated in America, someone with a very wide range of knowledge, and an economist, someone of quite sophisticated knowledge and experience. nonetheless, as well, has these quite far-left leanings, which are quite alarming to the establishment. And so you have the development of a kind of early socialist party, which is possibly as much a single party as a kind of coalition or understanding among groups. But certainly there's a perception that George Papandreou and even more his son are a kind of threat to the establishment, and that they will win the election. It is scheduled for June 1967, and a group of officers decide that they're not going to stand for this, and perhaps with a normal lead from the king, but perhaps not. They actually launch a military coup in April 1967. And so you get what is called the Colonel's coup, which materialises not entirely out of the blue, but I think many politicians on the centre and the right are initially, shall I say, not very happy. And then their unhappiness turns to sort of complete disgust, I think, when they realise that the colonels really lack any kind of administrative experience, that although they promise to return to civilian rule, the colonels themselves are becoming increasingly pleased to be in charge. One of them, Colonel Papadopoulos, emerges as the front man. Things get more complicated when King Constantine decides, after all, perhaps that the colonels are not such a good idea, tries to organise a counter-coup in December of that year. This all fails, so he has to flee abroad. It's a confusing situation. I think the trouble is that the perception now is that because of the period of political chaos in the early 60s, the inability seemingly of politicians on the left and right to agree or to form a stable government, that many of those civilian politicians were themselves, to a degree, to blame for the difficulties that arose and for the coup itself.
And yet it is unique, isn't it, in amongst the European nations in staging a coup at this stage?
Yes, that's correct. There is no other European country where there's actually shall we say, a successful military takeover. I mean, there was nearly a coup in Portugal in 1974 with the coups on the left and right. There was a threatened communist coup, as it were, in Portugal. There was a threatened military takeover in 1981 in Spain, Colonel Tejero, who tried abortively to seize power because he didn't like the election of a leftist government in Spain. But there's been no sort of successful military takeover, if you can call it that, ruling a European country for any length of time in recent history. So to that extent, Greece was unique in having this sort of particular misfortune. There was also a situation in which the colonel's government rapidly became something of a laughingstock, and indeed became sort of obviously sort of very...
And what were the colonels? What was the establishment so concerned about in the Papandreou electoral victory? I mean, was it that was it really a military issue and control of the military? What was the real worry there?
I suspect there were two things. One, that many of the right-wing officers who had been, I suppose, involved in activity either during the Civil War or subsequently, there was a sort of nasty episode with a sort of crypto-communist deputy called Lambrakis, who was murdered in 1963, and eventually the police and officers concerned were prosecuted. But there was a suspicion that many things of that kind would come to the surface, that officers would be accused of complicity and illegal interference in politics. But I think there was also a suspicion that Papandreou and people further to the left were really a front for a resurgent socialist or indeed communist takeover, that effectively there will be a complete lurch to the left and the imposition of some form of one-party state. That may not have seemed enormously credible to everybody, but certainly to those on the right, I think there was a suspicion that this might happen.
So this was height of Cold War paranoia. Is that the right way to think about it? Augmented by the recent memory of civil war.
I think that's right, and also I think a perception that Greece has a rather old-fashioned economy. The tax system is very regressive. Those, as it were, who have property and power escape paying very little in the way of tax and enjoy a fairly privileged position in society at this stage. That essentially Greece has not moved forward it remains perhaps something of an anomaly compared to many other more developed Western European countries. And the military and those who enjoy substantial property and power and privilege are afraid that any development to the left.
And yet, one of the features which we've noted about Greece is, for example, there is, because of its history, its 19th century history, there is an absence of large landowning families that have, a sense of rightful ownership and tradition. I mean, the elite is surely very much a mercantile elite. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I think it's probably safe to say that many of the people who have money are those who have made it either fairly recently. There's certainly who have international connections, but probably by the 1960s, there are a lot of people who have suddenly done reasonably or substantially quite well for themselves, often by means that are not perhaps entirely legitimate. They've essentially obtained lucrative contracts from the government by means that are not entirely transparent, of not declared or paid their taxes, are enjoying some degree of privilege as a result of personal political connections, and are worried that essentially a change of political regime will remove all that from them, subject to their activities to scrutiny. So they have particular concerns. And it's not so much I describe as sort of professional people in Britain who fear a Labour government will impose slightly higher taxation and make life a little less pleasant. There's a real fear, I suspect, that for many rich people in Greece, a change of regime pulls away the entire source of their income
and way of life.
Yes. Society. That's right.
Yes.
It's a much more drastic thing than that, because of the importance of having influence within the state and access to those politicians who are in a position to dispense patronage and contracts. Control of the political process is that much more important and vital. Because at this stage, certainly,
right,
a lack of, say, transparency and
this class, this elite and rather privileged class, on the whole, is not too concerned with the colonel's coup. Are they happy to go along with that?
I think initially what you find is a great many people assume that the colonel's coup is rather like all the various coups we've sort of touched upon in the period before the war and the various sort of interventions in the military and politics since then. The trouble is that the colonel's coup results in a, shall we say, much longer period of attempted military government, and also an attempt deliberately to turn the clock back in various ways, essentially sort of forcing teenagers to go to church, and enforcing quite a lot of anti-corruption legislation, which I think was essentially sort of quite well meant, but sometimes the impact was a little bit haphazard. Whether you were caught by anti-corruption legislation might depend rather on who you knew and whether you were friendly with the right people. So there's shall we say, an attempt by the colonels to introduce a kind of supposedly moralistic, nationalistic, rather backward-looking sense of sort of morality.
Would Franco be the right a good comparison here?
Franco is really quite a close analogy. Obviously, the trouble is that with Franco's regime, he tries most of those things, but being in power for a very long period of time, essentially the regime which started out, as it were, with what they would call high moral principles, eventually, with power in a relatively few hands, inevitably you get sort of corruption creeping back, and it becomes a sort of very corrupt and very elitist regime in Spain, as indeed in many ways it continued to be in Greece.
A perception that democracy isn't working, and they think that they know how to sort that problem out, and they can sort it out with traditional methods,
really want to
as it
take
were.
Politicians away and sort of bang their heads together and give them a good dusting down and sort of re-educate them in the way of traditional values.
Yeah. The problem is politicians, is the kind of ideology.
It's partly politicians and partly the culture. I think the colonels would probably view a lot of aspects of contemporary Western culture as being essentially degenerate.
And hence the church itself felt quite comfortable with the colonels.
I think a lot of the more traditional clergy probably did. Broadly speaking, that's right. There were a few exceptions. The clergy who probably protested against injustices.
Yes. So it then comes to a sticky end.
Essentially, what happens is that Papadopoulos slightly becomes faintly megalomaniac. He effectively abolishes the monarchy, becomes the regent himself. There's a dreadful episode towards the end of 1973 where a peaceful protest at the Athens Polytechnic is broken up very violently by the police, and 20 people die. His colleagues are now becoming rather sick of him, and also the sort of very adverse international reaction. Virtually all the rest of Europe is really quite disgusted with what's happening in Greece, expels it from the Council of Europe. Foreign loans, integration of foreign organisations is clearly a threat. So Papadopoulos is removed, unfortunately, by somebody with an even more sinister reputation, Brigadier Ioannidis, who had been in charge of the Colonel Secret Police. Ioannidis runs the country until about 6 months or so. Clearly things are in a very sticky situation with the oil crisis, increasing Greece's energy costs, massive unemployment. His regime is clearly on the rocks. So he decides to produce a spectacular coup in Cyprus. Just to divert for a moment, Cyprus has been effectively independent but divided between a majority Greek and minority Turk community. Ioannidis and his Colonel Grivas concoct a coup where they attempt to assassinate Makarios, replace him with a more pliant right-winger called Nikos Samson, and declare enosis of the whole of Cyprus with Greece.
And this is essentially it's driven by internal the dissatisfaction with the regime internally, therefore go and get a military success externally against the historical enemy, the Turk. Is that...
Exactly right. I mean, this is a regime on the point of collapse that needs a spectacular success to cement its domestic position. So it does something extraordinarily risky and really provokes the Turks by attempting to seize the whole of Cyprus and do something which it knows will be absolutely unacceptable to Turkey and to its military. We have a disastrous consequence, which is the Turkish military invasion of northern Cyprus in the summer of 1974. And the Turks take over about 40% of Cyprus. Did you want to talk a bit about the background to Cyprus?
Well, yes, please do. I think it is something that we don't understand well enough. Yes.
What happened with Cyprus was that this was a small island, if you like, sort of tucked to the south of Turkey, not very far from Syria and Lebanon. It had historically had a majority Greek-speaking population with an admixture of Turks, a few Armenians and a few others. It was taken over by the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century expansion. It remained an Ottoman island essentially until 1878.
It strategically has a very important place in the Eastern Mediterranean, strategically, for military purposes, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It's a large island that provides an obvious naval base for anybody seeking to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. And that was very much Britain's concern and interest in the late 19th century. The British government was anxious to be able to assist the Ottoman Empire in resisting Russian pressure. The Ottomans were quite happy to allow the British to occupy Cyprus and place their forces there to control the island from 1878 onwards. Come the First World War, Britain effectively takes the island from the Turks and continues to run it in the period between the two world wars. There is some agitation among the majority Greek Cypriots, particularly in the period around 1930-31, for enosis or union with mainland Greece.
And sorry, just to be clear, the strategic interest is not just the Mediterranean, but of course the Middle East. I mean, it's just it's the perfect base for Britain's interest in the Middle East, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. And at this stage, of course, Britain, as it were, controls the Mediterranean. It has bases in Gibraltar and Malta, and has a dominant interest in the Suez Canal. And there's also the British mandate over Palestine and the Transjordan, and substantial British interests in maintaining, propping up pro-British regimes in Iraq and the Gulf. Oil is becoming increasingly important. During the Second World War, Britain also resumes its right to reoccupy Egypt, which had at one stage also been run by Britain. So Egypt becomes effectively a British base, being attacked by the Germans and Italians. So Britain is very concerned, I think, to keep its position in Cyprus, both before and during and after the Second World War. After the Second World War, it becomes rapidly fairly evident that the Greek majority population in Cyprus are seeking some form of closer union or enosis with mainland Greece. It also becomes apparent that the Turkish population would find the prospect of being swallowed up by Greece quite unacceptable. The British are reluctant to part altogether with Cyprus. So there's a three-way struggle going on in the 1950s. Greek government under Karamanlis is subject to domestic pressure, but quite unwilling to break with the British. Eventually, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, comes up with a solution that is, shall we say, satisfactory to nobody, but, shall we say, just about acceptable to both the Greeks and the Turks, which is that Cyprus becomes an independent state. The presidency will go to the Archbishop of Cyprus, who is a quite political figure called Makarios, Archbishop Makarios, who is the kind of leader of the Greek Cypriot community, both in religious terms and also in secular political terms. And there will be a vice president who is a Turkish Cypriot.
And it must be said, at that time, the populations aren't physically separated as they are today. There hasn't been a population movement.
At that time, there was very much more of an admixture in different villages in different parts of the island, were either Greek or Turkish, but the populations certainly were not in any sense rigidly separated. There were probably more Turks in the north and Greeks in the south and west, but there wasn't, as it were, a rigid boundary between the two communities at all. So there was some prospect of trying to get the Greeks and Turks to work together and to cooperate, but this was bedeviled frequently by small disputes on the ground.
And the Macmillan deal, of course, maintains the British bases.
Yes, it does. Yeah. The two British bases at Akrotiri and Deucalion remain British sovereign base areas. They're quite small, so they're only a tiny part of the island, but on those sort of reduced patches of soil, Britain effectively keeps its bases and its sort of reduced ability to operate. It has to be said that after the Suez Crisis and particularly after the withdrawal of the British forces from the Gulf in 1971, there's rather less of a need for a main base area. But Cyprus becomes correspondingly very important, I think, for intelligence activities over the whole of the Middle East, listening effectively to what's happening in Lebanon, Syria.
And so this game that we see the United States playing today, which is one of coming up with political settlements that are such that they can maintain military bases in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, etc. This is the kind of game that was being played in the post-Second World War by Britain.
That's absolutely right. Britain was very anxious at work to prevent Greece and Turkey coming to blows with Cyprus, but really scratching its head and desperately trying to find a solution that was at least tolerable to both parties. And the British frequently say, well, if you could agree between you, Greece and Turkey, on an acceptable solution, we'd go with that. The trouble is the Greek and Turkish governments found it extraordinarily difficult to find something that was acceptable to their domestic opinion. So they ended up with what was seen as essentially a flawed but just about tolerable solution from 1960 onwards.
And it is indeed internal Greek politics that disturbs that balance.
That's absolutely right. There was a major crisis in 1964 which had repercussions for both Greece and Turkey. Then in 1974 you have the crisis flaring up again, and the Greek military junta, for its own domestic purposes, effectively trying to inflame the situation and to make a grab for the whole of the island, which results in a disastrous intervention by Turkey.
Disastrous for the Greeks, yes.
Disastrous for the Greeks. I mean, a lot of people died in that military intervention. The Turks would doubtless say that it was essential for them to make a response to Greek aggression. From the Greek point of view, the Turkish invasion resulted in the displacement of a very large number of Greek Cypriots. Many were killed or forced to leave their villages, lost their possessions. So and it clearly inflamed the situation, made it very much more difficult.
And so we get a return, 1974, another great ethnic movement and the separation of populations, what had been seen in the 1920s in between Anatolia and Greece happens again at a smaller scale in Cyprus.
On a considerably smaller scale, but there is a very large, as it were, displacement of population. People have to flee. Some of them go to other parts of Cyprus or to mainland Greece, and many of them go to the United Kingdom, settle in London. And you also have Turks who are similarly displaced or find themselves on the wrong side of the line. So it's a very unpleasant situation for a great many innocent people, and it results in an exacerbation of the international tension.
Indeed, it continues as an unresolved and
yes, essentially it continues entirely unresolved, because what happens is that the Turkish army, having taken over northern Cyprus, gradually relinquish a certain amount of it, but by no means all of northern Cyprus, and eventually they set up their own independent state of northern Cyprus in 1983, which is recognised only by Turkey and by nobody else. And so effectively the Greeks continue to say that Cyprus should be the whole of the island, and there should effectively be a kind of majority control in some shape or form over the whole island. The Turks take the view that effectively partition has proved the only solution, and that the world should recognise northern Cyprus as a separate entity, and there has never been a satisfactory resolution of this particular crisis. Greek Cyprus joined the European Union as a separate nation. Turkish Cyprus remains essentially an unrecognised and, if you like, sort of unintegrated entity, and the problem, as it were, has not had a proper solution between Greece and Turkey, and it's not resolved by the international community.
So back to 1974. So we've been through one of the consequences of the colonels trying to cling on to power in 1974, but they don't succeed, and indeed it blows up in their face, and they lose power.
That's correct, and almost immediately you have the return of Constantine Karamanlis, the veteran politician from before the colonel's rule. He effectively wins an election. He essentially re-establishes New Democracy as being the respectable democratic face of the Greek right wing.
Well, it's the first time the name New Democracy appears, isn't it? Before,
that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So New Democracy essentially sets out its stall as being a sort of a democratic sort of pro-business party in Greece that is going to rule constitutionally, but certainly will help reintegrate Greece back into Europe, back into NATO, and effectively build bridges with all the countries which have shunned Greece under the colonel's rule.
So in terms of sort of ideological terms, comparing it to other European parties and movements, is this Gaullism? Is it more like a Heathite Toryism? Is it FDP liberalism? What is this party?
I think it's probably fairly centrist pro-capitalism. One would say it was a conservative party, but I think you'd say that Karamanlis was essentially a progressive but pro-business, essentially recognising that, in his view, private business is really the motor of the Greek economy and society, and that New Democracy has constantly sought to, so I say, shrink the size of the state, intended to view the civil service and related bureaucracies as being inefficient and something of a drag on the Greek economy. So the aim is always to look for smaller states, smaller national spend, more incentives to business.
Already in 74, this is already the programme, the 1974 programme. It's already one of shrinking the state, of making an environment conducive for business, private sector business investment, and joining the European Union.
Absolutely, that is critically important, but takes quite a long time to achieve. And of course, I suppose the attitude is, shall we say, that we're in favour of competition always, but you have to have regard to the sort of very particular circumstances of the Greek economy and its difficult recent history. So you have Karamanlis negotiating with a view to try to maintain and increase common agricultural policy subsidies for Mediterranean produce. So there is, shall we say, a recognition that the state and state subsidies certainly have a role.
But at the same time, I think actually there was a very interesting open democracy article on this, whose name I shall find before the end of the podcast. But actually, Karamanlis is quite he nationalises quite a lot. He's actually quite comfortable with state ownership, isn't he?
Well, that's absolutely right. When there are difficulties, he nationalises the Greek airline, and he nationalises the major oil refinery. And this is not done, I think, in an ideological way. But it's, to give ground sort of potential difficulties, make sure that strategic parts of the economy, as it were, continue to function satisfactorily. So it's less, shall we say, a sort of violent ideological split between a sort of pro-capitalist and pro-socialist programme than you might suppose, but undoubtedly New Democracy is generally more, as it were, pro-business and generally, as it were, right-wing than the emerging PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Party that Andreas Papandreou then proceeds to organise and to build up, which becomes increasingly important during the course of the 1970s, and which ultimately wins an election by a fairly convincing majority in 1980. And curiously, at that point, PASOK is very sceptical about the European community, threats to either withdraw or totally renegotiate the terms. It's also relatively more hostile to NATO and the United States, certainly than Karamanlis.
These are important ideological differences, aren't they? I mean, this puts PASOK onto a real sort of sovereignty first left-wing ideology.
Yes, I think it's very much shall we say, Greece needs to rebalance itself, not to be taken for granted by the United States or Western Europe, move away from sort of semi-colonial perception of Greece is simply there to be patronised by its bigger friends. It needs effectively to be a bit of a mover, stirrer and shaker to, shall we say, apply a bit of leverage, to do so by increasing contacts with the USSR and the communist bloc, also by developing contacts with more radical Arab states or revolutionary Iran, increasing the range of Greece's overseas contacts with a view essentially to extracting, I think, a better bargain from its traditional allies, particularly the United States.
But there is a view also that that there is a real sentiment that Greece has not been in charge of its own affairs and its own destiny, and this time must come at last.
I think that's absolutely right, that Greece has been too much taken for granted and viewed as a sort of small, weak partner. And I think this perception is, shall we say, made much sharper by the perception that America values Turkey very much more as a NATO partner than it does Greece. Turkey has a far bigger population. It's relatively more important in terms of its role in blocking Soviet Russia from access to the Middle East. Greece is smaller, shall we say, sort of less populous, ultimately perhaps less critical in terms of its strategic situation. Therefore, in the Greek perception, the Americans have always unfairly favoured Turkey.
Or at least in the PASOK perception. Is this shared by New Democracy?
I would suspect that it's quite general perception, and that the PASOK probably articulates this
into politics, right?
Emphasis. This is a sort of particular line. I think it's probably a fairly general perception. I think the sort of PASOK line is more that, shall we say, we have to be difficult. We have to inflict some sort of perceived pain upon the United States to make them notice us. Whereas I suspect the New Democracy line will be far more, well, we have to sort of speak nicely and make the Americans understand that they can't take Greece for granted. That it's
and New Democracy says we're trying to be good Europeans.
Absolutely. I think that the perception is certainly, as far as Greece is concerned, that they need to be into the European club, that there are quite strong benefits from Greece in terms of not only agricultural subsidies, but also expanding international trade, a market for Greece, for Greek products, and that the expansion of international trade will, in the long run, be a great benefit to Greece, even if there are some difficulties for Greek industry from competition from international firms in the shorter term.
Now, the article I mentioned earlier, which I've now found, The Causes of the Greek Crisis are in Greek Politics, by Takis Papas, who's a professor of comparative politics at the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki. His argument is that what happens in 1981, the victory of PASOK, is that PASOK changes the nature of Greek politics by creating a mass party, a mass populist party based on patronage, and that New Democracy then follows, and that sets the tone for the next 30 years. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
I think it's shall we say, an assessment that has quite a lot of evidence to support it. I think possibly what you also have to consider is that personal politics and political patronage was pretty important for that. But what you have with the gradual growth of the Greek economy, with the arrival of substantial governmental funds, as it were, through the European Union, is a quite substantial expansion of the potential for political patronage. In a sense, the state has more money to distribute, more patronage, more potential political power. The role of the civil service grows. The civil service certainly becomes quite politicized, even down to a sort of in a fairly sort of middle-ranking level. Appointments tend to be made on the basis of political loyalty. So I think you have perhaps, shall we say, a considerable, noticeable expansion of trends that already existed in Greek politics. Certainly, PASOK has a, shall we say, a sort of broad ideological thrust to it, and it's more than just the Papandreou dynasty. But at the same time, obviously the role of powerful individuals within Greek politics remains fairly central.
And also, according to this Papas article, New Democracy actually plays along with this game very happily. That it also then starts to colonize the public sector, so that ideology of the immediate post-kernel period, which you described, actually doesn't survive for very long.
Well, I think what is fair to say is that as the Greek economy and the Greek state grows, you have the politicians sort of anxious to use the possibilities. I think there's a perception that, shall we say, that there should be some degree of overall objectivity and appointment on merit in terms of the ideal, but when it actually comes down to the practicalities, making sure that some particular important supporter has jobs found for their nephews or grandchildren, then the sort of the immediate and the practical perhaps takes precedence.
I suppose that one of the questions that one feels one needs to ask at this stage is, it seems as if we have a form of democratic political competition based on two-party politics, which actually, in a sense, starts competing in just the wrong way, in that it entrenches that particular political culture. Is there? What's your view of this?
I think this is a problem in a great many countries. I mean, we have to be absolutely clear, of course, that Greece is in no way unique, that in many other southern European countries, in Latin America and Middle East, and not to mention much of Asia and Africa, all these countries have experienced similar difficulties. The government machine, as it were, is a very potent and important employer. The temptations to use the government machine as a way of building up support and patronage, it's an impossible pressure to exist. And I suspect the Greeks have, at times, tried relatively hard to, shall we say, try and guard against the worst excesses, but in practice it's proved quite difficult to do so. So one sees, I think, Greece as a country which has made efforts to move closer to Western European standards of transparency, but actually in practice, particularly in hard economic times, has actually found this sort of quite difficult to progress on the ground.
The story that's been told of Greece since the Second World War is one of a very divided society whose relationship to the state is very is complicated, and we have a broadly speaking a left which was excluded from the state, a right which has tried to occupy the state by force, and what we end up with is a sort of a settlement in which we no longer fight, but what we do is each side tries to occupy that state by means of patronage. Is that a fair view, that actually that deep division, which was so traumatically lived through, never resolved, is that part of what leads to difficult government?
I think part of the difficulties of the government, it's partly a sort of struggle for control jobs available. I think it's partly also that there is no agreement and constitutional definition of precisely how the electoral system should work. So you constantly have a process of adjustment, moving sort of closer to a genuine PR system or further away from PR towards some form of first past the post system, or something like a sort of reinforced PR that gives extra seats to the majority. And I think this has a tendency to make people feel that the rules of the political game can be changed almost at whim, and that the majority today is only there because of some degree of sharp practice, and this could be changed very easily given the political crisis. So there's a lack of, shall we say, sort of continuity and legitimacy in political institutions. That's not to say that people don't respect the rule of law, it's simply that I suspect people are always assuming that something will turn up that actually changes the rules of the game fairly fundamentally in favour of their own party. And there is thus a difficulty in buying in to any political solution of a difficult kind that you don't accept and feel could be improved upon.
And so one of the things that Professor Takis Papas suggests in the conclusion of his article is that is a point about political culture, and he quotes Professor Nikos Diamandouros, who characterises Greece as having an underdog political culture rather than a modernising one. That actually there's this sense of an outside that has a defensiveness, a hyper defensiveness against the outside, and he sees that as defining the relationship of Greek citizens, the political relationship of Greek citizens to their state. Do you rather than your sense, which was rather an institutional account of what has gone wrong, do you take any of that? Do you accept any of that political culture story?
Well, I think yes. I mean, clearly, the element of patronage, the sort of, if you like, the patron-client relationship has been quite important and continues to be. I think for many Greeks, there's a perception that they need to modernise, they need to move away from this, shall we say, rather traditional but obstructive way of doing things, and that they need to develop far more of an individual, knowledge-based, to some extent, market-based, outward-looking economy. At the moment, obviously, there are very considerable obstacles in the way. If we're actually in essentially a deflationary period of austerity, it becomes quite difficult to trust to the power of the market, and it's quite understandable what people are turning back to the state and saying, we're in a really dreadful economic situation. There has to be some move on the part of governments and part of international institutions if we're to actually break the logjam and move into a situation perhaps where we can modernise the economy and actually deal with some of the more fundamental economic problems that have bedeviled Greece and many other countries for years.
And so, very briefly, I mean, we have with this has been extremely interesting. But very briefly, we're now in a situation in which PASOK and New Democracy are in a grand coalition, in which it looks as if the oppositional role has moved on to Syriza. Is this a crisis which will redefine the Greek political culture?
I think the answer to that depends very much on whether, as it were, the broader Eurozone crisis is capable of resolution by the means that politicians currently hope, or whether, in fact, a bad situation gets worse. You could say that New Democracy and PASOK, despite having been the sort of main political rivals for several decades, have now come together in recognition of a kind of harsh reality, which is basically that it's not going to be easy for Greece to simply walk away from its debts, because if Greece defaults altogether, essentially one of the main victims will be the Greek domestic banking system. Obviously, if they effectively exit the euro, break with the international bailout, they will find that their own banking system and banking system of Europe is imperiled. Therefore, one could say that PASOK and New Democracy reluctantly recognise that Greece is caught in the hook. It has to come to terms with reality. There's very little it can do in reality to break away from the broad terms that the European Union, the Germans and the French are imposing. And Syriza, I suppose, recognises the deep popular unhappiness and is urging, as it were, its European partners to reconsider the entire austerity strategy, knowing, I think, for the moment that there's relatively little chance of this, but thinking that perhaps if austerity fails to produce the goods across Europe, it may be part of a broader movement to urge a more, shall we say, expansionist inflationary policy as against the austerity,
Yes,
relatively deflationary policy proposed by Angela Merkel and others.
although one has to say that the story that you've told is not one which would particularly want anyone to return to the status quo ante before the crisis.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that what you've had in Greece is a real difficulty in achieving political stability and a real difficulty in ultimately coming to terms with a competitive modern world. I think, on the whole, that the Greeks are substantially beginning to learn the lessons of their history, realise that there has to be a degree of modernisation of Greek economy and society. I think that lesson from the past essentially is being internalised with the sort of shock treatment of what has happened. There is still, I think, a very genuine split, not only in Greece, but one suspects in many other countries, as to the actual best economic path forward. And that's a very much sort of broader.
Yes, of course, and is rather short term, as opposed to the long term view of this conversation. But back on that long term view, and just as a final reflection, I mean, there is something paradoxical, isn't there, in a country which has some very, very strong institutions like the army, the church, and these two great political parties, but actually has a weak state in the sense of the loyalty of its citizens, and particularly its elites, towards the state. That actually, problems of tax evasion are very substantial. I mean, there is a stereotype that the Greek asks for everything from the state and gives very little to his state or her state. Is there paradox there, and what are its what are the consequences?
I think there is a degree of truth in that stereotype, in the sense that in the past the assumption was perhaps that it was far more important to look after your locality and your immediate social group, and that the state was slightly remote and in any event, shall we say, sort of slightly corrupt and questionable. The taxes you paid were not necessarily going to go for useful social political causes. People didn't perhaps feel that sort of paying tax was a necessary and patriotic thing. I think the perception now is that there really has to be a change in the system. People do recognise the defaults and difficulties of the past, and appreciate that there has to be a way of moving forward, but the disagreement is just over how to do that, both effectively and fairly.
Well, there we have to leave it, and of course, with all that future quite undecided. Terence, thank you very much. I very much look forward to our next topic, which we haven't decided on yet, but I look forward to scanning my own lacunae and ignorance and suggesting a topic to you for very soon.
Jenny, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about Greece. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope it's been of some interest to your listeners out there. Thank you very much.
Terence, goodbye.